Hmm. Ah, okay. Welcome to office hours, Wednesday office hours. Oh, 25 March. Time flies. We're having fun. Um, this will be kind of lengthy in the sense that there's a lot to cover. Um, there's some advantages in doing it this way, and for the most part, it was a very useful exercise because it allowed me to get certain things to be straightened out. So that's, I think, the usefulness of this. So I'll begin. So we're looking at more melt, the monetary equivalent of labor time. And to give you the big picture of this, melt is a way, addresses the fundamental issue, which, we've had several centuries of this now, or we're in the second century of working out how the so-called transformation problem, how is it that prices and values and ultimately labor are connected. And, some people are very rigid about this idea of a labor theory of value that, and should one be sort of inerrant, a fundamentalist um, about what Marx said or what Marx was interested in. I think you need to remember that, Marx, this is what I've mentioned before, the volume one, was sort of the masterwork, and a lot of things get straightened out in volume three. But the point is that the only thing that got really published was volume one in Marx's lifetime. So everything else, with all due respect, is kind of Engels' take on it, Engels' editing, among other couple of other folks who did editing when things moved, in terms of the Soviets, etc. So, and then laid against that is the idea of the Grundrisse that, doesn't appear for many, many years, and also provides a kind of background for the problem. Now, it's not really a problem, but within the context of not only radical political economy, Marxist thought, uh, and we'll look at some different, both bourgeois economics and or neoclassical economics attachment to this kind of problem. Um, so we'll look at a variety of things. Needless to say, the solution, in the to cut to the chase, and I will, sort of spoiler alert. The temporal single system model, the uh, TSSI model, is a better way of approaching the problem. But that does not mean to say that you can conceptualize dual systems or parallel elements, because in fact, development is always uneven. There's always asymmetries. There's no symmetry. Seeking symmetry is certainly an interesting idea, and it makes all your makes your math work. But the reality is that it's an asymmetric world, with all due respect to certain bilateral symmetry. Blah blah blah. So let me get on with this now. And we may not get to the end of this today, but the point is to think about this in a bigger kind of way. And the point I'm trying to make, and the reason why I do what I do, or why I'm doing it this way, is to work out how is it that you have these, how is it that we get fractures? How is it that, because if you understand a kind of fracturing in these models, you get a better sense, and it is the reason why you can take a deconstructive approach to Marx, even though people will disclaim it and blah blah blah. There's all kinds of whatever discourse on it. It still, I think, is methodologically useful, but we shouldn't stop there. I mean, most people, in the humanities or whatever, in the non-social sciences, trying to make your bones by a particular kind of the uniqueness of an approach, and that makes it exceptional and subjective, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, I don't have any particular purpose in needing to create a reputation or prestige on the problem, because I had originally planned to do that many years ago, but it never sort of worked out that way, and I don't regret it at all. It just, and I'm grateful that I have a little time to work on this kind of problem. So anyway, we'll get on with this without my yammering. So welcome to the Wednesday office hours. This is a useful statement, and it is a one that allows you to avoid dealing with people who are obsessed with metals, the gold bugs, etc. Because this should be a law. Gold cannot be an objective measure of its own value. Gold cannot be an objective measure of its own value. And this is a logical question, and one worth spending a lot of time on, but we're not doing that right now. To recognize this is an important question, because, of course, in Volume 1, Marx uses gold as a sort of a front end example to talk about money, to talk about commodity money, blah 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 blah. But it is, as I said the last time, it's a convenience. It's not. It's meant to be relatable. It is, a way in which you can talk about. If you were using Capital Volume 1 to organize trade unionists, for example, this would be the easier way to explain it. You could explain the money system that way, and it's historically accurate in a variety of ways, but ultimately, under capitalism, we've moved past that. It is, in fact, why there is, with respect, a capitalism, or at least that's the way I would see it. That is that there are things that, while we are materialists at one level, we also are materialists in a way that allows for critique, self-reflection, dialectical movement, and gold doesn't quite do that. I mean, it's useful because it has been used for centuries in terms of trying to form economies, but we're not there anymore. I mean, we just aren't. I mean, there is uneven development, and there are economies that are less developed. But we don't really have barter systems. It's still all about currency of one kind or another. And it's much more complicated than that, of course, with the idea of financialization and blah, 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 of financial capital as opposed to uh, merchant capital or industrial capital. Note that I've used those divisions before, and you should remember to do that because, in fact, in a modern context, even in the uneven development, there is, and I don't want to go on about why that might be the case, but you can argue, without getting too deep in the weeds, that capitalism is sort of around in a kind of different sort of way. And you could argue that in the pre-modern or the feudal period, that there's proto-capitalism exists, but that's a thing I don't have a second lifetime to look at. Um, and why is that? It is because the early currencies do have a kind of a different range to ways in which you talk about credit and debt. And in fact, one should explore usury systems, um, um, other kinds of ways in which you created a kind of monetary system or monetary systems, and that there's a formal way to look at that, but there's also informal elements that are built into this of credit and debit and other kinds of things that always do exist. And of course, the worst example or the best example of that is how families are structured. How is it that you can they're always they're the ultimate bank, your parents or whatever. So without going too far afield, anyway, so the point here, or the front end of this, is to reconcile Marx's value theory, labor theory of value, with modern monetary theory. And yes, there is a literature that tries to separate them, and without, with respect, it's not so much wasting time. It is interesting, but it's not very productive because you have an entire body of Marxist theory and a nice or useful instrumental subfield of modern monetary theory that allows a reentry of certain um, to talk about socially necessary things in a much more ubiquitous way, to be able to talk about labor, to be able to um, uh, create an institutional critique of the kind of current situation of greed, avarice, venality, all that stuff. It Capitalism is a bad thing, and be able to critique it properly, I think, is really important. And modern monetary theory allows people who are talking about government or the state to work through, certain other elements without either alienating the arguments that relate to capitalism and the larger regulatory frameworks which are necessary in order to harness animal spirits or whatever. The United States is currently going through this kind of problem where um, uh, there's less regulatory control, and hence, as within a formal economy, you have informal um, violations of the rules, and in some ways acting in usurious ways, or uh, acting as though. Well, anyway, it's important to see that modern monetary theory fits in with the critique. It's not problematic. None of it is problematic. It is, in fact, easily interfaceable, and people who try to separate out it just as a useless uh, exercise. I mean, an interesting one, but doesn't have much usefulness. So, now let me also state that, yes, I use a lot of artificial intelligence now because, on the one hand, it does do slop. It creates problematic judgments, and often has very contradictory biases built into how it operates. And it means always that you have to check on your stuff, because occasionally it says really stupid things or contradictory things, or, things that are even nonsense. So you don't rely on AI. You don't act like an undergraduate or whatever grade school person and sort of say, well, that's enough. They'll take it as it is. No, you actually have to go back in and sort of, work through the issue. I mean, for me, it it is a great way to do tabular kind of divisions and structures and outlining. And I don't take them at their, at face value. It sometimes they do, categories that don't make any sense or that come from a certain point of view in a theoretical way and in a linguistic way that are not very useful, um, that are actually counterproductive. So you have to sort of work through why you're doing it. It's not laziness so much as it provides a faster structure, because I hate outlining things and I much prefer to have a kind of crude outline, which is what I consider AI to be doing. It doesn't matter which platform. I recognize the differences among platforms and the need, and there is sophistication and blah blah blah. But um, at the current moment, it's just useful to me as it's a note-taking device. It is a organizer, um, but it has flaws. So take what we're doing here with a grain of salt, and I'll try to do the kind of corrections that are necessary when you use an AI, a large language model, system. So, this web page synthesizes Marx's labor theory of value with modern monetary theory, arguing that they are theoretically compatible through the concept of melt, the monetary expression of labor time, and the redefinition of labor power as the de facto money commodity, quote unquote, in a fiat system. So fiat currencies exist prior to capitalism. Um, uh, what they do is provide a certain type of objectivity. You could call it a kind of objectivity. Um, what you can't do or shouldn't do is to get tied up with this, defining what a money commodity is, and uh, because there are commodity concepts that do deal with financial issues, and I think I get to that at the end, that are really important. They are the key, as actually the AI helped me out with, or at least made it the reasoning faster. It is the key element that brought the 2008 crisis. It is because financial products were treated as commodities in the subprime mortgage context, and that's why people got into trouble, and mainly because they were motivated. They didn't care. They didn't care whether people had adequate equitable amount of wealth or were living beyond their means or blah blah blah. And they're just weasels. They're people who are it, without getting into it, it's, venality or avarice or whatever. There's certain moral conditions under which some people operate that are ultimately inhumane or anti-human, and are problematic in general. And ultimately, you can make psychological or psychiatric judgments on why is it that someone would act that way. But and in fact, you can actually work it out in very clear terms. And we have the best example of it in the current way in which the American government is set up. You can actually see psychopaths at work, and psychopaths not simply as psychopaths, but psychopaths messing up the economy, and you can see that in operation currently. But anyway, the redefinition of labor power as the de facto money commodity in a fiat system. Melt, well, I'll refer to it as melt, further on. Money expression of labor time. Melt links Marx's abstract labor value to MMT's currency valuation. It's reciprocal indicates how much labor is needed to produce 1 unit of currency. This doesn't, the unit is more generic, and you have to sort of work through this to, as I've discussed earlier, that you deal with kinds of layers or levels of abstraction in this. It's not as simple as saying abstract concrete. It's not a simple dichotomy. It's a much more problematic one that has a range of truth and falsity to it that you have to sort of work through the differences. That's why difference is important in considering looking at economic systems from as it were, a deconstructive point of view. Anyway, so MELT links Marx's abstract labor value to MMT's currency valuation. Now, note that value is sort of floating around here, right? And the point of constructing value in this way is to see it as a human endeavor, that is value. Animals don't estimate value. I mean, I think that they estimate certain degrees of importance for ecological survival, but the decision making about that is more, is less cognitive in the more immediate sense, but of course evolutionary in the big sense. And of course, the means by which you can address that argument is the idea of punctuated equilibrium. But anyway, that's another story. Under MMT, labor power, not gold, functions as the money commodity, especially under a job guarantee policy. This is the key element of why MMT is important at this moment in history. That is, that you could actually get, if people would get their act together, job guarantees, the universal, basic incomes, etc. Job guarantee policy sort of fits in that. And the fact that it anchors wages and prices to a socially determined labor value is really important. This is the key element of the transformation. If going back to the transformation problem, is to see how is it that people survive, sustain themselves, and how is it that people need to be treated equitably, or less, not to be burdened by inequality, or you could get to the real root of it is class struggle and all that comes with that. But you're not sacrificing. This is not being reactionary in that context. It is still ultimately all about class struggle. It's just that you need to get the details worked out, and the struggles are built on these kinds of differences of wages, prices, job guarantees. As I've said before, your pay stub is the true definer, in fact, of value. Not that the values are the numbers, but the values are the differences of what's being built into your pay stub. And that is insurance, taxes, all of that is there. The pay stub does that. It can do that. Not that you should do it that way. It just happens to be an artifact of this entire, your place in the economy or whatever. And the fact that it is dominated by a single employer or institution, even though it refers to much more generic elements, is truly important. But anyway, so TSSI is the temporal single system interpretation, and there's several decades of work done on this. It is, on the one hand, fully fleshed out. On the other hand, it has people who, not that it's kind of a cult, but it at certain moments, certain members of people who subscribe to this, treat it more law-like than rule-like, and have unfortunate elements about thinking about this as a paradigm. And on the other side, there is, you can critique it by saying, well, and that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of talking about it as a totalizing discourse, is the idea that often this kind of centrism, as it were, not dissimilar from logocentrism, is that this kind of center periphery model, as it were, from a structural point of view, that trying to totalize this can be problematic. But fortunately, or whatever, um, you don't have to buy into that, And, the contradiction, of course, is to be able to indulge this and then, have Christians in your family or religious types. It just, it runs totally counter to a whole bunch of other philosophical elements. They're just incompatible. Um, or they bump, however you want to refer to it. Anyway, temporal single system interpretation advocated by Kleiman and Freeman. Now, I respect both of these guys, but I don't, some of their conclusions, Kleiman, for example, there's a certain moment at which it not that it doesn't make any sense, but he kind of overindulges certain ideas that need to be sort of re-articulated in a different way, which is why I've been applying other methodologies to this, because once you started going down this quote unquote value road, you get a little um, you don't appreciate the larger systemic issues that are addressed by people like Sheikh or whatever, that try to say, Cockshot and others who say, well, you really have to sort of think of this in a much bigger algorithmic way. Now that we have this is the thing I keep referring back to. Now that we have computers, we can actually test some of these kind of propositions about the differences among large data sets of income and Piketty's sort of issues. All of those are addressable at because we have better technology to support calculations and stuff. And I would assert to you that once we get to a kind of quantum position with quantum computing, etc., that it will allow for the kinds of things that one could think about in a utopian way. Um, but ultimately, that's the good side of it. The bad side of it is that people will use it, to be fascists and shit. So anyway, the temporal single system interpretation advocated by Kleiman and Freeman rejects Borkowitz's simultaneous and dual system critiques, asserting that Marx's values and prices are determined historically within a single system. Historically within a single system. And it sounds just easy, it kind of seems intuitive there, that that all seems like it fits. But the fact of the matter is it doesn't fit, and there have been constant struggles about it, some of which are built or exist at a theoretical level, and others have other empirical things that people kind of throw in at it, and that gets it all screwed up. And of course, there are other kind of issues that are peripheral and in some ways uh, 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 problematic, but they sit in the background. We can talk about that some other moment. Now, Marxist theory does not depend on commodity money, period. That is, Marxist theory does not depend on commodity money. Note before, when we were talking about the difference, um, looking at Cleaver's model and David Harvey's model, you see the evolution from the commodity concept to move to abstract, certain degrees of abstraction, that is concrete and abstract stuff, value, constant and variable, capital, and all that other stuff. Each of these kinds of interesting dualisms have uh, uh, are not strictly dual. Let's put it that way. And so, um, but the concept of the commodity unfortunately dominates the discourse because of volume one of Marx. That is, that at that certain moment where he suddenly decides, I need the commodity, the idea of a commodity and commodity fetishism to sort of front end the whole thing. And remember, I think it is, and without getting into the details, I think it is that purpose in terms of talking about commodities, talking about commodity fetishism, and looking at it as a sort of a kind of economic anthropology deal. It's a 19th century idea that all of that influences Marx's Volume One of Capital, so that to talk about commodity and commodity fetishism is a way, as I was talking before about gold, is a way of making it relatable in that sense. So, but the problem is still there. Fiat currency can still serve as a universal equivalent by measuring abstract labor. Now, even just to reduce it to that, as the AI does, uh, it is abstract labor is a combination of things. It involves, this other idea that Marx does talk about, and is a as it were, a later development or a subsequent development that doesn't get fully incorporated into volume one. Is similar, but not identical to the value form problems. But anyway, so abandoning commodity money, for example, gold. Gold is a commodity money, and hopefully, you can see how that kind of works. It's the it's the treasure of the Sierra Madre. Resolves theoretical inconsistencies in Marx's transformation problem, particularly the money problem tied to gold's pricing role. Now, lest you think that's unimportant, it's pretty clear that you have the gold standards, constantly polluting the ways in which we think about an efficient or an effective capitalism in the 20th century. So this is not a trivial matter. This is important not only for doing theoretical work and doing Marxist work, but also thinking about the whole concept of economies. So anyway, the natural price, as defined by, and of course we're thrown off by the word there's a whole other thing, it's overdetermined, and that's that the natural price is defined by classical economists and later refined by Anwar Sheikh, is a long run equilibrium price determined by production conditions and the average rate of profit. And the more important point, it's pretty clear that you can have long-run equilibrium prices that are determined by production conditions, the average rate of profit. That seems all kind of normal. This is not Marx talking. This is you can see at this level that it's clear there's a connection between setting, particularly in long run or at scale, equilibrium price determinant of production conditions, the average rate of profit. That seems non-controversial. But the point here, of course, and this is, I think, where it all breaks down, is to talk it about, to critique it, to sort of fuss with it, or be obsessive about the idea of using the word natural, because it is. You have to sort of code it out and say, well, maybe it's just about conventional as opposed to something that is natural. And in fact, that's the way we talk about natural things often, is that it seems natural just because it's conventional, or that it is you could argue that folk theorizing is kind of like that. But anyway, but a socially and historically embedded concept, and that should be not controversial, because we're talking about the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. You're talking about things that are, in fact, socially and historically embedded. And you can even get screwed up by the idea of embedding things, but that's another story. Now, Paul Maddock, whose work I include further down, critiques Samuelson's attempt And I included it because it's a kind of key element. Maddock is really sort of is underappreciated, his position in this entire discourse, and is always worth reading. Critiques Paul Samuelson's attempt to reduce Marx's value theory to bourgeois equilibrium models, arguing that Marx's value is a social relation rooted in exploitation, not a technical input. And that just, it's just a matter of convenience, in fact, that Samuelson would do that. But the reality, and this is the problem when you look at neoclassical stuff, that it has certain ideas that it should be talking about, but doesn't, and it doesn't talk about them because it gets in the way. The math doesn't work out as well, and you can't do all the kinds of things you want to do, even if that doesn't, you're getting it to sort of work properly is not a good thing ultimately. You can make stupid decisions because of that. You can argue, in fact, that certain Keynesian ideas, have that kind of problem, or Keynes is an example of that. And anyway, the TSSI movement defends Marx's original theory against alleged inconsistencies. There's a whole set of, there are decades talking about logical inconsistency in a variety of Marxist arguments. And often they're, sometimes they're magical, and in other cases they're good. There's good logical reasons, but you have to sort of take it apart and put it back together. That's why, if you look at G.A. Cohen's work, you have to think, well, that just, that logically makes sense, but it makes no sense in reality. And that's kind of our some theoretical problems are sort of operate that way. Emphasizing hermeneutic rigor and pluralistic scholarly engagement to avoid dogmatic exclusion of alternative interpretations. So you can see underlying this is that problem of a kind of orthodoxy that, or sort of a sub-orthodoxy that it can exist. And yes, it does exist within, Marxist economics or political economy anyway, for all the usual reasons. And because, Marx is, in terms of thinking about Marx, Ricardo, Smith, etc., you need to sort of think about how they are indulging a variety of alternative interpretations, Marx's use of Stewart, et cetera, et cetera. There, you have, in the history of economic thought, you have a lot of things that just either didn't get included or weren't considered and sort of need to be included. I mean, for whatever they were done, and understanding that it is uneven, they are uneven developments. All right. Anyway, Fred Mosley, who we'll look at a little section down below, and his Money and Totality book, which I think provides a useful overview of the entire history of working through the problem, which, it's a magnum opus in the sense that Money and Totality, not unlike Sheikh's book on competition, is a capital and competition, is, these, a lot of thought has gone into this. Now, whether that had a good end is, questionable or discussable. But you can also see kind of where they're all coming from. Everybody has this thing set of things you want to work out in your academic life, and sometimes it doesn't get published until late in your life, or it doesn't get sort of crystallized. Which that's the thing of looking at works like Sheikh's work or Mosley's work. So, macro monetary interpretation reinforces that Marxist theory works with fiat money. That is, money need not be a commodity. Only a socially accepted measure of abstract labor and modern credit money fulfills this role. So, and this is important to distinguish between, you having measures of abstract labor, but not, and you can deal with it as a problem in credit, etc. But you don't have to go to commodity, Because often this commodity question, as I mentioned earlier, with the idea of certain elements of financialization or finance capital can be commodified or operate as commodities. I even got the AI to agree with me on it, or it's logical that the AI would get to it, and that drives the kind of analysis that makes explaining the 2008 Great Recession kind of easier. Now, whether that's useful to solve the problems in the current, many years later, is another kind of question. And it's you have this monolithic capitalist system with all these different institutional ways of talking about stuff. And as I've said before, it's good that there are clusters, at least in the world, that is more Marxist thought or more tolerance of Marxist thought existed in British, the Anglo and Anglo-American kind of political economic discourse, to at least offset the lack of it in the American side of the Anglo-American divide. And it's, it can be dealt with, and obviously somebody's dealing with it in terms of the history of economic thought. But one needs to pay attention to why all these things, have these little difficulties or are created in certain ways. It's like dealing with Minsky's work or Kalecki's work. All these things have contingencies built into their logical systems. So why does this matter? It matters. This reconciliation shows that Marx's critique of capitalism and MMT's policy tools can coexist. The state's monetary power doesn't erase Marxian value relations, but shapes what I was just talking about. It shapes the institutional context in which they operate, enabling a more dynamic, policy-responsive analysis of capitalism's contradictions. And it is this moment in which you can see, kind of, as I just mentioned, a kind of fracturing between, what's working between various elements under capital, how capital operates in that way, and to conceive of capital as not so two-dimensional or whatever. It's more dimensional, let's put it that way, n-dimensional. So I had a little set of ideas here: the problem of historical determination, explaining more fully fiat currency, and credit money. Now, these are, on the one hand, abstractions. On the other hand, you need to have this apparatus in order to properly think about a whole bunch of other set of relations when you get back to the issues that were important for Engels, etc. Certain social ecological examples, as Bellamy Foster has sort of implied. All right. Anyway, there's this a set of articles by Paul C. at the Head Economists. And kind of where I started with thinking about this was this relationship between Marx and modern monetary theory. One point of entry appears to be the monetary expression of labor time melt, introduced by Alejandro Ramos Martinez in Chapter 5 of the New Value Controversy. That's the background text against which we're looking at this, which is a collection of really interesting articles, but and interesting in the way in which they're kind of assembled. So you include somebody like David Feldman, but you include him because you need somebody to sort of bounce certain concepts off of, and in fact, I think that's his purpose in being the first chapter in the New Value Controversy text. But anyway, in connection with MMT's value of the currency, in considering this connection, the temporal single system interpretation of Marx's theory of value shall be adopted. Chief proponents include Andrew Kleinman and Alan Freeman. And there's a whole bunch of things that this Paul C. has referred to in terms of that. And getting back to this, I included a thing to talk about what is a Marxist perspective, and as dogmatic as some folks would like to make it, um, it's not. It actually is not very controversial. It is. It has a theoretical bent, and in the hands of certain people, it can be a good and a bad thing simultaneously. I'll give you an example. It's my impression, even though it's just taxing in terms of Chinese, that that uh, PRC Marxism does have a particular kind of flavor to it that is problematic, but it may only be problematic because it's in English, or when it gets translated into English, that may be the only real problem it has. But anyway, capitalism is adversarial, exploitative, and undemocratic. Workers are, in practical terms, compelled to accept employment conditions that involve working a large part of the day to produce, yes, surplus value, which is exploitative in the sense that who gets it? Well, some of it gets redistributed, but it mainly goes to people who kind of function parasitically, and that's pejorative, but that's kind of where Engels' factories were. But anyway, and have little say in how it's invested, that it is inequitable or or anti-democratic. Number two, this adversarial nature of capitalism makes it conducive to economic growth and innovation because of the pressure for capitalists to press for productivity improvements, mechanization, etc., that temporarily aid them in their class struggle with workers. And yes, the class struggle goes both ways, and we see this every day. Often not, it's reflected, of course, in wages, but there's all kinds of other, depredations that are part of the history of capitalism, which only makes people think about commodities and commodity fetishism even more because of the way capitalists and proletarians think about this crap. All right. Anyway, the bourgeoisie versus proletarians in that sense. All right. Number three, capitalism is prone to recurring unemployment crises stemming from technical innovation, demand deficiency, and disproportions in production and consumption. And that's not controversial. There are, crises stem from technical innovation. There are issues that create, on the one hand, whole new things or revolutionary moments that are about demand deficiency, and disproportionate production and consumption just come with the territory. I mean, that's kind of the whole dynamic, and it happens because of all the other circuits of capital problems that are operating. All right, natural prices defined in classical economics, the price of a good or service when it is determined by the inherent cost of production, including labor, capital, and raw materials, and in the absence of any distortions such as market power or externalities. This is an important moment or point. This is the difference between, as it were, Department 1 and Department 2, but it's more than that. But it does indicate the kind of productivist bias of certain ways in which we can argue. Now, that's not, that's not ubiquitous necessarily, but it is an important element of the background. And when you see people who write in English on this, that you can see how, on the one hand, you just sort of accept it. On the other hand, you accept a lot of other things at the same time, but that's another story. The term natural and natural price is a bit of a misnomer rooted in classical economics tradition. Here's what it actually means. Natural price refers to the long run, remember we're talking about long run equilibrium price of a good, the price that reflects the underlying inherent costs of production. Now, sometimes, with respect, the only way you can see this is at scale and over time, and so it automatically or inferentially is spatio-temporal in that particular sense. So it's called natural because classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, etc., believe this price was determined by objective structural factors in the economy, as opposed to temporary fluctuations driven by supply and demand in the market, which they called the market price. Now, this seems like a simple division. On the other hand, you can see that this desire to create objective structural factors underlies a whole variety of other, thought. The idea that you always can apply a physical science model to, economies. And at one level, you probably can or could, but to do it or to do it too often or without critique is the issue of neoclassicism. You sort of, you you capitulate to neoclassical economics or even Keynesian economics by sort of thinking about this in these sort of structural ways that structures are, unimmutable in that sense. This is the issue of post-war economics and particularly Keynesianism, and, of which we are still, sort of sucked into. Um, for example, military Keynesianism. The idea was that market prices would tend to gravitate towards the natural price over time. You see, there's, making it a kind of gravitational center or baseline. See, this is where the analogies get all problematic. You think too much about physics, and it is, on the one hand, like gravity, but on the other hand, it's not like gravity at all. Or it is about a different way of thinking about gravity, which ultimately will become important at a whole different theoretical level. I mean, it's like thinking about black holes, for example, relative to gravity, because our whole relationship among these things has changed, since the 19th century, whatever. So, anyway, there's a whole blah 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 on natural, um, and then I put in a thing on money commodity no longer a viable concept. So the concept of commodity money, that is where money derives its value from the intrinsic worth of the material it's made from, and there are centuries of this, right? Metallic coins, etc. Is no longer viable for modern economies, primarily because it lacks the flexibility needed for dynamic monetary policy and economic management. And yes, that's true. On the other hand, if you're wandering around the streets or whatever, cash is important. And in the reality, in the informal economy, cash transactions are really important because no one can keep track of it, or no one. Ultimately, it can be tracked down, but you're going to see this kind of other issue about uh, information or currency as a kind of information, which is a whole other way of looking at it. So modern economies rely on fiat money, which is backed by government authority and public trust, rather than physical commodities, allowing central banks to adjust money supply to manage inflation, unemployment, and growth. So, as I said, it happens at scale. And it is to ultimately think about certain kinds of abstractions that are intolerably problematic. I mean, public trust. I mean, the current example is, fighting wars or whatever is a breach of the public trust, inevitably. Anyway, additionally, commodity money is impractical for large-scale trade due to issues like, of course, a shitload of dimes, right, from Blazing Saddles, portability, divisibility, and storage. While commodities like gold retain value outside their monetary use, why all the people keep jewelry as a kind of familial store of value. Their fixed supply makes them unsuitable for responding to changing economic conditions. Yes, but on the other hand, people, do all this other stuff and play with gold bars and crap. Anyway, thus, The shift to fiat systems reflects a preference for stability and adaptability over the constraints of physical packaging. This is just modernism, right? To be able to say that the state has some relation to the money system is fairly obvious, but you can see that there are people who, because they're reactionaries or stupid or whatever, that you know this concept these concepts need to be undercut, as though we liked the idea that there were X number of different banks and they would issue their own currency, etc., which is insane. So I included I've already yacked too much. Let me just say that we're getting close to the end, and I'm not even scratched the surface on this, so I'll probably talk about this more in another video or talk about it next week, in the next Wednesday office hour. Because there are important elements that, and it's the reason why everyone should study Shake, is to create and think about the economics as a science, and more specifically, Marxist economics is as a science, and you don't have to overindulge models in physics, et cetera, et cetera. Even though, yes, it's certainly possible to apply them, it's just that often an economy doesn't operate, like a steam pump or whatever. It's not purely on physical science doesn't always allow you to model it properly. A long period, long run equilibrium concept is Shake, not a short run market clearing price. The whole issue of market clearing is worth a whole nother set of lectures, but you can see conceptually that market clearing is a certain criterion that exists in the back of people's minds that is not, is perhaps badly executed, but in fact, the badly executed element of this supports other stupid things like credit debit creation and a bunch of other warpage and demand. But anyway, determined by production conditions, labor inputs, capital intensity, and technical coefficients, incorporates the average or normal rate of profit across the economy. Now, this idea, and we're going to come back to this because I think that it needs to be rethought of. Because on the one hand, you have ways in which you can talk about aggregation and a kind of centralized measures of things, and it's problematic only because you on the one hand think about profit rates, not profit itself, but just the rates. And this, similarly, it is the problem of interest. It is also a similar problem. But these are the key elements of how capitalism operates: is this kind of circuitry or this kind of movement that stock flow sort of relations. So anyway, and in all of this, we haven't talked very much about the market. Why there are markets, why markets are constructed. Recall that there are political forms that some people would argue that you need to not think about markets, because markets, if you're a Soviet, you begin to think, well, why have markets at all? They're just, inefficient distributional methods. And at one level, they actually are. And you need to sort of rethink what counts as things you do or don't need, or that you do or don't need relative to a consumer-built society. So, it's not that it's a waste of time to defend the consumer or to uh, uh, check on certain or regulate certain conceptual elements, but often, and with respect to liberalism, that's just not fully getting to the issue. It's important to have some sort of institutional method, but if you're a libertarian, for example, it's unnecessary because that's what the courts are for. And so that's kind of, where we see the problems. So anyway, so there's that. And this comes under the context of head economist Paul C. And these articles are actually his articles are actually quite useful in the sense that they're pretty clear, and that then he makes the argument better than those who try to separate out Marxism from MMT. So um, I can leave a lot of this for the next time, but let me sort of do an overview of what we're going to be looking at. So I've included, as I said, Paul Maddox's article, Samuelson's Transformation of Marxism into Bourgeois Economics, and noting, of course, that Samuelson is thinking about Marx for a variety of reasons. He just wants to deal with it because he knows that, in his perch at that moment in history, you sort of needed to sort of work through how you felt about things like Marxism, considering there's all this, it's all out there, and uh, and your tendency or your desire is to make it more quantitative, or to at least make it sort of reconcile itself at certain quantitative levels. So anyway, so I've included a link to that article. And this is the AI working that sort of does the fast and dirty outline. Um, and some of this does or doesn't make sense as outline, so it's really better to read the whole damn thing. So anyway, and then you have new value, the whole issue of whatever, this is the crux of the issues on value that, Kleiman and Freeman and Wells are sort of dealing with. Unless you think that's unimportant, it's pretty clear that some people built entire, models around this kind of stuff. I mean, models that affected entire national economies. So it's not like it's, unimportant. So there's a whole thing in here on TSSI, the Marxist relationship to that. There's a whole thing that refers to the IWGVT, which is, the group of people who got together to talk about value theory. And frankly, I never got much out of it. I mean, I could see the individual contributions relative to the grouping, but I never saw the synthesis, a real synthesis. So, but you can get to all of their proceedings are available online. So. And I think you want to, there's various conclusions that need to be made about the difference between kind of classical Marxian methods and others. And then I included a chapter, even though I did it elsewhere in a different way, because I was just looking at Mosley on rent. But anyway, his chapter 6 is a kind of good overview of the background work against which we'll talk about TSSI. And that's the front end of the chapter, which is talking about the standard models of these things. And then I wanted to work through the credit money versus money commodity. But it's not as simple as that, because, as I've said, there's a variety or range of financial elements, etc., that are part of this discourse. It doesn't simply bifurcate that way. Let's see. Yeah, well, this is the AI kind of dealing with some questions I asked it. Try to understand, for example, how a counterfactual operates. Now, the AI believes that it is fictive, that it's only used to talk about what if hypotheses or hypothetical situations, and the reality, with respect, is that counterfactuals, as Neil Ferguson, for example, wrote a book trying to push that in a different intellectual direction. Although I don't think a lot of people dealt with that work, but I think Ferguson. It's actually, for me, it's one of the most useful pieces of Ferguson's writing. The rest is, moves off into neoliberal sort of claptrap at some moment. But anyway, that's another story. And then we see below the discussion of G.A. Cohen. Um, as I said, this AI is useful for, as I said, outlining, doing sort of trying to put the key points all together. So that's, for me, it's a good use. But often, as I just said, uh, uh, in terms of counterfactuals, it doesn't give you the whole story. And that's the superficiality. And with all due respect to the technology, that's the limit against which you think about AIs and LLMs. Um, it'll give you answers, but they're not really the answers that you want. It's only the superficial or front end kind of thing, because the algorithm has done it in a this big statistical probabilistic way, and that doesn't always answer the question. And particularly if you're trying to do an outline, you need to sort of it needs to reflect some of those other elements. So the details, as it were. What else? And then I put a bunch of other things in here about yes. And for me, the key element, and one which is not fully fleshed out in a lot of articles, um, the commodification of financial instruments of one kind or another. And, how did the 2008 crisis occur? It's got those elements in it. And I think they're worth talking about. You know, securitization and risk. I'll stop in a second. Securitization and risk dispersion, standardization, securitization and risk dispersion, standardization and fungibility, mispriced risk and ratings reliance, and that is part of a whole other set of problems, and leverage and liquidity mismatch. So and of course derivatives and synthetic exposure. There's a whole decade of problems that are built in the capitalist economy that are only covered over by the fact that there's sufficient wealth to cover certain stupidities. But anyway, and then there's opacity and complexity, all of which are very important ideas. So in short, treating securitized credit products as commodity-like tradable assets combined with poor underwriting. That's a very key element in the 2008 crisis. Flawed models, and that's always a problem. Leverage, which is sort of the mother's milk of it's the it's commodity fetishism of the worst type in some ways, and regulatory gaps. And that's kind of when I'm talking about fractures and systemic fractures. Some of them are because of regulatory elements that are built into that. For example, you can do an economic example, but does it work, fully or properly within, for example, certain applications like antitrust, for example? Um, I would assert that there are real issues that are never fully. I mean, I know there are people who work on it. There's a woman at Yale who is the person to do this, and at some moment she's going to be back in government and probably will be the next a Treasury Secretary at some moment. But anyway, these are it's important to still consider this, even though it is constrained by political rather than political economic reasons. So that's another story there. Um, and so I included, for those who haven't listened to uh, uh, Hudson talk about the 2008 financial crisis, he has a conversation with the critical unity folks, and that's important or interesting. And then I get to a thing, and this is, you can ignore this, but this is the kind of cogitating that I find useful, and I even more useful is the idea that the AI is kind of tries to is it takes it at face value, or takes it as a matter of faith that you can actually work through this argument. And I found this rather quite interesting because it does structure the response, because it is an LLM, with kind of what we're thinking about, and it's kind of an interesting, sort of metaphorical way of approaching the problem. So anyway, I included some of that. Nobody studies this stuff. I'm probably the only person who thinks about this stuff, which is a good and a bad thing. But I do think that there's a way of talking about this, and I probably, I'm probably going to write something serious about this last section in the future. So, assuming some people were listening to me at all during this process, I'm gonna come on. Let me thank you for your attention. I'm going to shut off the live stream and then shut off the share. Thank you very much. We will discuss more of this next week, and I may have I may take out that little Deridian section at the end just because people will just laugh at it. But it is actually a really important set of ideas that's a little